Hello, welcome to Guide London. My name's Nick Salmond. I'm a Blue Badge Guide for London and a member of the Association of Professional Tourist Guides. That's the organisation behind the Guide London website. We have about 600 members in our organisation. Usually we'd be showing people around London at this time of year, but because of the current situation with the lockdown, we're unable to do that. So what we're doing is a series of live broadcasts here on our Facebook, our YouTube and our Twitter channels, trying to bring a little bit of London to you in the hope that when the crisis is over, you will come and visit us in person. Now, we've been going for about 3 weeks so far. We've done all kinds of broadcasts on the history and the culture of London. If you've missed any of our broadcasts, then you can find them all on our YouTube channels and on Facebook. Simply go and search for Guide London and you can find all our broadcasts archived there. And do subscribe to our YouTube channel. That will give you any alerts to any new broadcasts that we have coming up. Today we're celebrating the birthday of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. Her birthday was yesterday. She was 94 years old, and if you joined us on Monday, you would have seen an early birthday party for the Queen. On Friday, we'll be looking at the Netflix series The Crown, which of course details much of Queen Elizabeth's life. But today, in our history slot, we're going to look at one of her favourite residences, Windsor Castle, just outside London in the county of Berkshire. Now, Windsor is one of the Queen's favourite locations, and it's where she is staying at the moment. It's where she's locked down, staying there with her husband, Prince Philip, who himself is 98, and a few staff to look after them. And it's where she celebrated her birthday yesterday. But it's been in the royal family for nearly 1,000 years. It's been the home to many of our monarchs. And today we're joined by two Blue Badge guys to tell you a little bit about Windsor. William Mitchell is going to tell us all about the history of Windsor Castle, right back to the time of the Normans, when the castle was just a basic wooden structure, right through to the current day. And then Emily Baker is going to tell us about one of the kings who spent a long time living at Windsor Castle. That's George III. George III was on the throne for just under 60 years. And during his lifetime, he's probably best known as Mad King George. You've probably heard those stories of the Mad King George. Emily will tell you a little bit about the man behind the myth and also the man who features in the musical Hamilton. If you've ever seen the musical Hamilton, we'll hear a little bit more about that. So stay with us for that. We are broadcasting live, so if you've got any questions for either Will or Emily, then do write them in the comments page either on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll try and answer them if we can. But now I'm going to hand over to Will, who's going to tell us all about Windsor Castle. Will.
Yes. Hello. Thanks, Nick. So I am William Mitchell. I am a brand new Blue Badge Guide. I just qualified this year, so I don't even have my Blue Badge on because I haven't received it yet. It hasn't come through the post. But I'm not new to guiding. I've been driver guiding for a few years now, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Windsor Castle. And Windsor Castle is extremely famous as a site. As Nick said, it's the home of the Queen. It's also where Prince Harry and Meghan Markle got married a couple of years ago, and where his cousin Princess Eugenie married Jack Brooksbank that same year. It's in the media a lot at the moment, and with TV series like The Crown making the royal family even more visible on Netflix and other platforms like that. Windsor is a very popular destination at the moment, and I do spend a lot of my time talking to folk about the Crown. But I love Windsor because Windsor is a castle, and underneath all the modern media trappings and under the gilt and the garnishing of the previous centuries lies a real castle, which is proof against attack and built to last. And so here we go. So here's an image of Windsor as it was long ago. And I'm not saying that all the opulence and the pomp of Windsor isn't worth a visit on its own, but yes, Windsor is a castle. And so I thought I'd tell you about why I love Windsor. So here we are. Here's Windsor, or something like Windsor would have looked like right when it was first built, a Motte and Bailey castle. It's a very simple form of castle. It's built of wood. You have in the centre there in the centre of your screens the tower. The tower built on top of an artificial hill called a motte. And then you have a stockade or a bailey around the outbuildings of the castle. So almost in a way a sort of quite rural, a sort of a brutal take on a Roman fort, because the people who were building these motte and bailey castles were the Normans, who had come over from Normandy in 1066 with William I, or William the Conqueror, and they had conquered England. Now they didn't have many troops with them compared to the locals, so they built castles as they went, much like the Romans did previously. And the Normans were nothing if they were not the product of their Viking Scandinavian ancestors and the Roman culture that they encountered in northern France, where they were from. So they built castles like these. And in fact, if we look at Windsor, a modern picture of Windsor today, you can see in the center of the image there, that's Windsor, all built in stone as it looks more or less today from the air. And right in the center there is the tower. And the tower is sitting on top of that motte, that artificial hill that the tower is sitting on there. So that is the oldest part of Windsor Castle, the artificial hill that Windsor, the tower, is sitting on. And in fact, that's led to a lot of features of the castle. Like that tower itself is hollow because it couldn't support the weight of an entire stone tower. So where you can see the little round roof on top of the tower there, that is over the top of a light well, like a large empty area in the center of the tower, and is what we call a shell keep. It's just stone around the outside and still wooden structure on the inside. So as we can see, Windsor now, it's been built up in stone. It's been built up by the descendants of William the Conqueror, and it's arranged in these three wards here. We've got some circles there on the screen to show you the wards. So on your left-hand side there, the lower ward, that's the big circle to the left, that was sort of part of the original bailey. That's got the chapel where Harry and Meghan got married. So that's that was one of the first bits of the castle that sort of added up in stone. But in the centre there we have the middle ward, and the middle ward around the tower has the moat going around the tower. And today it is this beautiful garden. And if you go to Windsor Castle in August, you can actually go for a tour through the garden, through the moat garden there. People often ask if there was water in the moat originally, but no, we are on top of a hill, so they're quite difficult to get water to divert uphill like that. So no, it was just a garden like this. But if we look again at the overall image with our circles again, we can see now to the right hand side of the image the upper ward. Now the upper ward was added later as a place for people to live, and there we have an image of the Queen's private residence as seen across the upper ward. So where this photo is taken from, the photographer would have been standing in Engine Court, which is somewhere that you will visit on your trip to Windsor when you come out of the state apartments. And you're looking across this upper ward, and to the right hand side there, you've got this entryway that the Queen uses. That's her private gateway, and sort of more in the centre there, that protuberance is the porch where the Queen's car drives underneath there, and then she gets out and goes up into her private residence. So as I say, Windsor Castle from the air, and we can see this is the modern Windsor. So it really did get built up. There were lots of William the Conqueror's descendants adding work there in stone, and there's lots of stories of the descendants attacking or being attacked there. So, for example, Prince John, who was our king, who became our king at the end of the 12th century, when he was still prince, and when he was the character he was when he was the bad guy in the Robin Hood stories, he attacked Windsor Castle while his brother Richard the Lionheart was away on crusade and took it by force. And then years later, with the roles reversed, he actually hid out here at Windsor Castle when he was under siege by his barons in the civil war that he had led the country into. But it's not just, let's go forward about another 150 years to when Edward III is king. And so in the mid sort of 1300s, he starts adding real solid defences to the lower wards of Windsor Castle. This is like from the actual perspective of the town, and you're seeing the awesome D-shaped towers that are here on the bottom. This is castle building at its best. These are the best things for defending against siege, and missiles coming in are going to be deflected and things like that. Now, there's not much of Edward's castle that's visible other than, on the outside. You don't see many interiors other than the new cafe that's been added. But what we can see are evidence of one of the institutions he created, the Order of the Garter. So in 1348, he inaugurated the Order of the Garter, the highest honour of chivalry that you can achieve in Britain, in England as well. This, what we're looking at now, is St George's Chapel, which is the home of the Order of the Garter. So on your tour of Windsor, you'll get to go inside there. You'll get to see the banners and the heraldry of the living members of the Garter. But also when you go around the state apartments, which is part of the tour, you'll see the Garter throne room where new Knights of the Garter are invested. And you'll see the St George's Hall in the centre of the state apartments, with the heraldry of every single Knight of the Garter going all the way back to 1348. It's a phenomenal space to be in. It's fantastic. But the chapel itself wasn't actually built by Edward the III. It was started by Edward IV. So we're now talking about another 100 years forward in the latter part of the 1400s. And Edward IV wants to build a place at Windsor where his dynasty, the Yorkist dynasty, can be buried. Now, we only ever had 3 Yorkist kings, and 2 of them are buried elsewhere. So Edward IV's wishes didn't really go too well, but he is buried inside there. But the actual look of the place is because it was finished by the new kings on the block, the Tudor dynasty. So it was started in the reign of Henry VII, and then finished off in the reign of Henry VIII. Henry VIII himself is in fact buried inside there. And this is some more work that Henry did. These wonderful hexagonal towers. So we've moved on from siegecraft being so much of a big issue now. We've gone away from, cannons have made it so that round towers, even they can be smashed to pieces with cannons. So we've started to have these polygonal towers back. This is very typical of a Tudor architecture. But as I say, Henry VIII is buried inside St George's Chapel, which you can actually see through that gateway there. I mean, you'll get quite used to this gateway if you do go on a tour of Windsor, because this is where you'll come out and you'll see this on your way up. So you often meet your guide outside this point if you've had some time on your own inside the castle. But yeah, so Henry's buried inside St George's Chapel, and he's buried alongside his 3rd wife of 6, Jane Seymour. And actually, interestingly, in the same tomb is buried King Charles I. Now, King Charles I, who we're going to see there on the screen on the left-hand side there, that's actually a famous picture of him. That's on display in the state apartments at Windsor most of the time. Those 3 heads of his made for a sculptor, so the sculptor could see him from every side. Now, King Charles I has the rather dubious honour of being the only king of England who was in fact executed in 1649, and then he was buried inside the same tomb as Henry VIII there in Windsor. And next to him, that's his son, Charles II. Now, the 2 of them, the 2 Stuart monarchs who reigned in the middle of the 1600s, they are responsible for a huge amount of the interiors that you'll see in the state apartments, of the fabulous artworks, the Renaissance and Baroque artwork that they collected over the years that's on display there as well. And so they had a lot to do. And in fact, you'll see quite a few portraits of Charles II's wife, Catherine de Braganza, who brought the English tea, and it would be without tea. Now, they weren't the last people to make changes at Windsor. We're seeing here the Georges, the Hanoverians, so George 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Georges 3 and 4 did quite a lot of work renovating Windsor as well. But I think Emily is going to tell you now quite a bit about George III. So that's it for me. I'll pause at the end of the 1600s and leave Emily to tell you about George. So thank you so much for listening, everyone. I've been Will Mitchell. This is Emily now, and Emily's going to tell you about George III. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Will, and hello to everyone. Welcome. My name is Emily Baker, and I became a Blue Badge Guide 2 years ago following a career of freelance travel writing, and I thought I would put my love for London to good use. So I do all types of tours, but one of my favorite topics is monarchy. anything to do with monarchy. I love to talk about the individual kings and queens and also the institution of monarchy in general. So today we're going to talk about a king who's known to people on both sides of the Atlantic, King George III. And probably your perspective on him is a little bit different depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. He's known either for losing the colonies or for perhaps opening that door so that America could have independence. I feel I'm a good person to do this because, as you can hear from my accent, I grew up in America, but I've lived in Britain longer. So I have dual citizenship, which gives me that dual perspective on George III. Now, George reigned from 1760 to 1820, roughly 60 years. That makes him the third longest reigning monarch in British history, coming in after Queen Victoria and, of course, our current Queen Elizabeth, who has been on the throne for 68 years. George was the third monarch in the House of Hanover, which Will mentioned. And basically, that means the group of kings that came over from Germany. What happened was that when Queen Anne died without an heir in 1714, the Act of Settlement in 1701 had declared that there could be no monarch in Britain that was Catholic. So the powers that be had to delve deep back into the royal family tree and find a relative of Anne who was Protestant. And this was George of Hanover. He came over to England to be King George I. It didn't go very well because he never learned to speak English. He always wanted to be back in Germany, and he made frequent trips back. And the British people didn't really take to him, and nor he to them. So roughly the same could be said for his son, George II. But when we get to George III, well, he was very proud to have been born in Britain and to have English as his native tongue. So when he took the throne, he told Parliament, "I glory in the name of Britain." And he really did work on behalf of Britain. Now, in the family tree, you can see that our current Queen Elizabeth is actually descended directly from him. This is a condensed tree, obviously, but Queen Victoria was the granddaughter of George III, and then so on down to Queen Elizabeth. Now, unfortunately for George III, he's known really for two main elements of his reign. His bouts of insanity or madness, whatever you want to call it, and the loss of the American colonies. But this really does him a disservice because so much happened during his reign. There was Britain's victory in the 7-Year War against France and Spain, and this made Britain the world's largest colonial power. There was the successful resistance to Napoleonic France. And indeed, George provided stability during this period to English people. They held strong, and George really comes out looking pretty good relative to Napoleon. George really laid the foundation for the constitutional monarchy that we have today. He supported his parliament, and that's true when we get to the American Revolution. He was supporting Parliament's right to tax. Now, another element of George's reign is that he humanized the institution of the monarchy. He brought his family to the forefront. You can see here in this portrait of George with his family. This is 6 of the 15 children that he went on to have. But he made a big deal of promoting his family to the public as the ideal Georgian family. It was the model family. And this humanized the institution much in the way that today we know so much about the royal family. But back in those days, the kings were sort of high up and we didn't know much about them. They were godlike figures. But George III began to change that. So let's take a closer look at those two elements that he's dogged with, if you will. The first is the madness. You may have heard of the play, The Madness of George III. This was an Alan Bennett play in 1992 at the National Theatre. And there was a subsequent film made. And this, of course, perpetuates this business of him being the Mad King. He definitely had episodes of disorientation, whatever you want to call it, but they were just that. They were episodes. It was not throughout constantly his entire reign. The final one started in 1804 and then led to the regency. So his son, who ultimately became George IV, became Prince Regent in 1811. And that's when George III really began to drop from public view. But George, it turns out, was actually quite brilliant. He, the writings and records that he kept have just been released to the public. You can view them on the web, and I will give you the address at the end of this talk. But scholars have analyzed them. Scholars and medical experts have looked at them, and it's really interesting. It reveals a fuller picture of George III. He kept extensive records. He never had a personal secretary. He did it all himself. And it shows that he was hugely well informed. He knew what Parliament was doing. He studied science and astronomy. He was really on top of things when he was healthy. So his bouts of quote unquote insanity have been attributed traditionally to a blood disorder called porphyria. But now, because of this extensive look at these writings, experts believe that he may have been bipolar, and that would certainly fit with what the writings show. He has these periods where his vocabulary becomes more complex, his sentence structure is more complex, extreme brilliance, so mania on top of those periods of disorientation, which would coincide with a diagnosis of bipolar. So that may explain some of his behavior. And then we get to that American Revolution, the loss of the colonies. I grew up in Boston, where the Boston Tea Party is still being talked about. And this was the time when the American colonists who had gone to America to set up their own nation, really, to be independent. And they were objecting to being taxed without representation in Parliament back home. So George III wasn't giving them representation. And they literally threw all their toys out of the pram by throwing taxed tea into Boston Harbor. Now, unfortunately, this escalated into all-out war, as we all know. But perhaps if George III had reacted slightly differently, maybe shown more compassion, had more empathy, maybe he didn't really understand what the colonists were trying to do. He'd never traveled. He never left England. He really only traveled around his palaces in the London area. So he might not have had the empathy necessary. He also, within his personality, had kind of a stubborn nature, a failure to compromise. He thought that the colonists loved him and would return to him no matter what, which clearly was not the case. Some of you may have been lucky enough to see the play, the modern day musical of Hamilton. There's a wonderful depiction of George III here. It's quite funny. And he kind of swoons around the stage, and he sings to his American colonists, telling them, "I will send an armed battalion to remind you of my love." And it's very funny, but it's actually not so far off the truth. It is a silly caricature, but George probably saw the colonists as naughty children. He despised disobedience. He liked a really tight ship. He liked all his ducks in a row. And when people didn't line up, he didn't like that much. So that probably explains why he came down so hard. His writings show that he was a very stern parent, that he expected obedience. So he expected the same from the American colonists. And another element is that he wanted to defend the empire at all costs. Remember that Britain had just acquired all this territory, some 500 million acres in America came their way. So it would have been so humiliating for him to lose this territory. And he might have feared a domino effect where other parts of the empire would rebel in this way. So he had the Caribbean, Canada, India, all of these places he feared losing. So it was really a lot at stake for him. No wonder he was so firm. Now, before I leave you, I just wanted to give you some places that you can visit that are associated with George III for when you come to London. This all will end and you will come to London. The most obvious is Buckingham Palace, right in the center of Westminster. Now, Buckingham Palace did not look this way back in the 1700s. George is the king responsible for bringing it to the royal family. He purchased Buckingham House. And the way it looks today is because of Queen Victoria. But when George purchased Buckingham House in 1762, it looked as it does in this image, quite bucolic. He wanted a place of refuge for Queen Charlotte and his 15 children while he was hard at work in St. James Palace just across the way. One of the changes that George made in Buckingham House was he put in libraries, and he opened them to scholars. So he really was quite an intellectual. He accumulated some 16,000 volumes, and these today are visible at the British Library in St. Pancras. You can't actually access George's library, but you can see it really well because it's encased in glass. And when you see those 65,000 volumes, you realize, wow, he really did dedicate himself to accumulating a library. And then for a bit of fun, I would suggest you go to the Royal Mews, because here, in addition to all the carriages that belong to the royal family, you can also see the Gold State coach. And this one is the most opulent. It just screams empire. This was commissioned by George III. He didn't get to use it at his coronation, but it was used at every coronation following that from George IV. And I guess it's not a very comfortable ride. Queen Elizabeth very politely said it's not very comfortable. Queen Victoria went a bit further and described its distressing oscillation. It weighs 4 tons. It's amazing. So I would suggest that you go see that. And then, of course, Windsor Castle, which Will has already spoken so much about and told us so much about its history. But it's George III loved Windsor. He was a very outdoorsy sort, very similar to Queen Elizabeth. He had farms there, so he earned the nickname of Farmer George. And then he also did a lot for the townspeople there. He contributed a lot to the town of Windsor, earning himself the name of the Squire of Windsor. And then he's buried there. He's buried in St. George's Chapel. So you can see that burial site when you visit, unless it's a Sunday when services will be on. But at any other time, unless there's a special service, you can get in and see that. And then I just wanted to tell you to that web address where you can see the papers of George III. It's great fun. It's the Royal Collection Trust. And you're looking for just under collections and then the Georgian papers. It's absolutely fascinating. You can even see a schoolboy essay. So just to remind you, I'm Emily Baker. You can find me on the Guide London website, or if you want to know a bit more about me personally, at my own website. And thank you so much for tuning in today. And we all look forward to welcoming you to London soon.
Emily, Will, thank you very much, both of you. Some fascinating talks there. Windsor is one of the places that we go to a lot as Blue Badge guys, and it's always worth a visit. So, Will, tell us how you get to Windsor from London. Is it easy to get to?
Yeah, it's pretty easy to get to Windsor from London. It's about an hour from central London if you're in a car or a coach, and that's mostly traffic, so it should be pretty quick this time at the moment. But you can also get there by rail. But of course, make sure you take your Blue Badge guide along with you, especially.
Indeed. And if you have a driver guide, they will even pick you up at the hotel and take you all the way. So, exactly. And congratulations, by the way, because I know you qualified as a Blue Badge guide just a month ago, was it? You heard the news?
Yeah, that's right.
So,
yes, thank you very much.
So you haven't been able to do much guiding, but hopefully when the current crisis is over, you can get right into the spirit of it. And Emily, what about the places associated with George III? Can you actually go and visit Buckingham Palace and go and see what's inside it?
You can visit Buckingham Palace in the summer, in August and the first couple of weeks of September when the Queen is at Balmoral. But otherwise, you have to look at it from the outside, which is okay. But you can go to the Royal Mews, which are just behind Buckingham Palace, and see all the carriages. And of course, you can walk over to St. James Palace, which is very close to Buckingham. So there's lots to see, lots of royal sites right in that area.
Great. And Will, I know there's a way of telling if the Queen's actually in the palace, isn't there? Can you tell us what that is?
Yes, if you can see the royal standard flying over the drum tower in the centre there, you know the Queen's there. In fact, my Instagram story today, I've got a picture of the royal standard from when I was there before all this started.
Brilliant. So thank you both very much for some fascinating talks. If you want to know more about any of our guides, including Emily, including Will, then go to our Guide London website, search for guidelondon.org.uk. You can search for guides individually, and you can search for tours as well. And I think one of our tours that you can search is Windsor, and that will tell you all about the castle. There you are, Windsor Castle tour. That'll tell you what some of the things you can see at Windsor, and down at the bottom there's a form you can fill in, and that will help you find a guide to show you around one of the most interesting places to go while you're in the United Kingdom. So join us on Friday at the same time, 4 in the afternoon if you're watching in the UK. That's 11 in the morning if you're watching on the East Coast of America. We'll be discussing the television series The Crown, the Netflix series, which tells us so much about Queen Elizabeth's life. So join Simon Whitehouse for that on Friday, but from Will, from Emily, and from me, for now, goodbye.
Bye, everybody.